Welcome to Hive Mind. This is Edge with my co-host Speaker. Hey Speaker, what's happening?
Not much. Just another crazy day in Australia and the police state that I live in. What's happening with you?
All good over here. It's not crazy at all, I promise. Well,
Crazy
I,
times, dude.
I thought this would be a good discussion because it's just completely different from, the world that's going on around us right now. We can kind of escape into this amazingly interesting topic, which I know that we both really get excited to talk about. I've always been a huge fan of Indiana Jones.
You,
I
you and I
love
both.
I love researching ancient mysteries, and there's probably not anyone that's greater than the Great Pyramids. And Speaker, I know that you told me once that you always wanted to be an archaeologist, right?
I did. You just let my secrets out, like live on the podcast? Damn. I did want to be an archaeologist, but I had a little bit of trouble in history, not because I wasn't smart enough. It's because of, you can say the ego behind history teachers and grades. And we'll get into that because this is actually a big part of this, especially with Egyptologists and those special sorts of a field. They don't like being critiqued,
Very true. That is a
and,
big part of this
and
story.
especially as a young student that is critiquing his teachers, it didn't really work out too well.
But
So
you went and visited the Great Pyramids of Giza and the Sphinx, didn't you?
I did. I was young. It was a
Tell
long
us
time
about
ago.
it.
Wasn't that young, but it was a while ago. So I went on a trip there. I went there for about 14 days, and it was absolutely amazing. Because I love old history and I love these old places, it was an absolute incredible experience. And seeing the Great Pyramids, the pyramids of Giza, we went to the Valley of the Kings. It's where a lot of the pharaohs are buried. I rode a donkey there. It was a great experience. I really got behind it. I actually blended in so well in Egypt that I actually got mistaken for an actual Egyptian. I had tourists like asking me for directions. It was It's a true story, right? But like when I go to a country, I get right into it. Like I blend up. Like I probably would have made a good spy back in the day. Put it that way, right? I was wearing all my traditional Galabaya and my Egyptian garbs, and but it was just fascinating to see these things because you can't really compare. I mean, you can look at pictures and you can look at videos, but when you're standing in front of the Great Pyramids, there's nothing like it. It blows your mind. It's just an incredible feeling standing against these, especially in the pyramids case, one of the oldest, if not the oldest, structuring monoliths that there is out there, and it blows your mind.
It's mind
Uh,
blowing just researching it, but I can imagine being right there face to face with it. I went and visited Tulum, which is a ancient Mayan ruin in Cancun, and that blew my mind. I can only imagine what the Great Pyramids would have been like.
Nothing compares to it. Cairo itself is a bit of a dodgy city. I was traveling by myself at first. That was a bit okay, but Cairo is massive, so it's a very very large city, and something a lot of people don't really know is the pyramids are kind of like just on the outskirts of Cairo. Like there's all shops and stuff around it. It's not too far away from your actual main city. It's not like a big drive or anything. It's like 5 minute car trip from the city to the pyramids.
Well, that's convenient. So you can go to the city, you can go visit these ancient, gigantic structures that hold so much mystery. And that's what I want to get into today is the mystery of these structures. There's so much that we could talk about. We could talk for hours, but we need to try and summarize to the best of our ability and give people different perspectives, don't you think? Because there's a lot of controversy on what they mean, when they were built, who built them, why they were built. So I want to get into all of that. But I'm
Yeah.
hoping this conversation that we go through today is going to give kind of both of our perspectives as well. Like the Indiana Jones, how he was this studious bookworm nerd. That's me. And then you're the adventurous type that actually goes and visits the structures. So we'll give both,
100%. It's a
we'll
good
give
team.
yeah, both
But
perspectives.
it's also to give everyone listening at like different perspectives. It's not that we don't know if any of this is factual or true, but it's just our speculations and theories that are going around, and it's really up for debate because there's a lot of things about the Great Pyramids that are not, or ancient Egypt in general, and we're going to focus mostly on the Old Kingdom today. And the Old Kingdom was around about 2613 BC to about 2181 BC. And it was also known as the Age of the Pyramid Builders.
Right. And so let's start with just the basics of what these pyramids are and get into a little bit of the factual side of things, which in itself is fascinating. So, and then we'll go on to some of these other areas that we really need to get into that have sparked a lot of controversy. But so the Great Pyramids, they consist of three pyramids. Two of them are almost the same size and they're diagonally aligned. And then the third one, it's a little bit smaller and offset. And then we have the Sphinx, which is a monument and it's got a lion's body and the head of a human. So the Great Pyramid, it weighs about 6 million tons and it covers about 14 acres. That's massive. Was it that awe-inspiring when you saw it?
Yeah, it's mind blowing.
Yeah.
You can't explain it. It's really hard to explain something like that unless you're standing next to it.
Yeah. So each side is about 750 feet long and it's 481 feet tall. There are about 2.5 million blocks used. And some of those blocks, they weigh about 70 tons and they were raised about 300 feet. It's crazy.
Yeah, so most of the blocks are between 2.5 and 15 tons, and then you've got the pillars, which inside the Great Pyramid there's separate chambers, and in those chambers there is these massive stones that are about 70 tons, and that's a whole different level.
Yeah, you
A
have
whole
to,
different level. Even today, like it's crazy.
the architectural feats that were accomplished in this thing is just mind-blowing, absolutely mind-blowing. It would be a feat to accomplish it today with what we have today in construction advancements. It's insane to think about. But within the pyramids, especially the Great Pyramid, there are a series of chambers and shafts. Within the Great Pyramid, there is this subterranean chamber that's about 100 feet below the ground. And then about 100 feet above the ground is the Queen's Chamber. And then about 100 feet above that is the King's Chamber. And there's a series of shafts. Some of the shafts come jut out of the chambers and go all the way out to the exterior of the pyramid structure. And so some scientists had put a small robot with a camera to go inside one of the shafts, and it was discovered that there was actually a door on the other side with handles on it, leading to another apparent chamber, which I don't think anybody has ever entered. So I think there are actually chambers that have not been discovered or explored, correct?
Yep.
Which is
Earn the money.
interesting. Uh-huh. So the chambers, according to Orthodox Egyptology, are believed to be burial chambers, but there's no remains. There's no burial remains that have ever been found in the Great Pyramids. And it's not necessarily based on scientific evidence. It's really more based on Egyptologists and scholars and what they've interpreted. There's not even any inscriptions inside of the pyramids either, right?
Yeah, so let's backtrack a little bit. Apparently, these pyramids were made as tombs, and the first one, which is the Great Pyramid, or the largest one was built for the pharaoh Khufu. The one after that is built for the pharaoh Khafre, which was Khufu's son, and then the smaller one was apparently built for the pharaoh Menkaure. Now, this is of course a huge center of debate whether these were made, and I don't think there's any scholars or researchers or Egyptologists or even authors that have debated the fact that they all kind of similarly agree that the pyramids were built around this time and was built during the reigns of those three pharaohs. Do you agree with that?
During the fourth dynasty. No, I don't agree with that, actually.
You don't agree with that?
And we'll get into when these were built and the debate on that. But they say that the Sphinx was also a tribute to the fourth dynasty pharaoh Chephren.
Yeah, well, that is something I can debate with you about. The pyramids, not so much, but the Sphinx, yes.
Okay, because the Sphinx has been reconstructed, I believe, multiple times, particularly the head, and you've seen it in person. A couple of things that you had mentioned to me were that the size of it was not incredibly impressive compared to the pyramids themselves, correct?
Yeah, well, anything standing next to the Great Pyramids is going to look a little bit, a little bit not impressive. But there's misalignment on the Sphinx, and the head being pretty much the majority. If you take ancient Egyptians, they did not do anything by chance. Nothing is random. And with the head of the Sphinx, it doesn't line up with the body of the Sphinx. It's completely out of proportion.
It is much smaller than the rest of the monument. The head is significantly smaller, disproportionately smaller than the body.
And
It's
that
odd.
brings in the debate whether the head was resculptured.
Right. And we'll get into that, I think, in just a minute. But I did want to say something that's absolutely fascinating about these enormous ancient structures is that they're without a doubt built by these master astronomers, master engineers, and they were extraordinarily great mathematicians as well. I mean, the precision with which they used mathematics to align these structures with true north, it's almost perfectly aligned with true north, down to 3/60ths of 1 degree, which is an engineering feat that's hard to accomplish even today. It's insane to me. They also incorporated pi into their construction, and that was not even supposed to have been discovered at the time that these structures were said to be built. So it's very, very strange how much knowledge and wisdom these engineers had. First of all, the size and the scale of the Great Pyramid is directly proportional to the size and dimensions of the Earth, as though they knew the size and the dimensions of the Earth. When they, at that time, we were still trying to figure out if the Earth was flat or round. And so
They didn't really know if they were on a planet. They didn't even know what a
exactly.
planet was.
Exactly. I mean, if you take the height of the pyramid and you multiply it by 43,200, you get the polar radius of the Earth. And if you take the radius of the base of the pyramid and multiply that by the same number, 43,200, you get the equatorial circumference of the Earth. So in other words, it's a mathematical model of the dimensions of the Earth. And it was built at a time where they weren't supposed to be able to have the knowledge of the dimensions of the Earth. It's insane. So this number 43,200, it doesn't seem random. In fact, it's a multiple of 72, and 72 is a key number in tracking the Earth's precession of the equinoxes. We talked about the precession of the equinoxes pretty well in depth in our Georgia Guidestones podcast, and I'm not going to go over in huge detail about that. If anybody wants to go back and watch that, we encourage you guys to do that. But it's basically just this wobble that the Earth makes in a cyclical cycle over 26,000 years, and it shifts 1 degree every 72 years. So that number 72 is very important in this mathematical language that they use, and you see multiples of it a lot in their construction, as though they're constantly speaking to that. And so it's very interesting that they use that number. But so they were very interested in tracking the precession of the equinoxes. And what Robert Bauval had discovered back in the 90s was that the pyramids and the Nile itself are like a three-dimensional representation of an exact time during the precession of the equinoxes, but not at the time that these pyramids are said to have been built. It's actually at a time very specific. So if you look directly up in the sky and you see Orion's belt, it's two large stars diagonally aligned, and then a third smaller star slightly offset, just like the pyramids. And then the Milky Way River is just off to the side of Orion's belt in that specific time, 10,500 years BC. And the Nile and the three pyramids, the three great pyramids, draw that exact star map at that exact time, which just blows my mind. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's hard to comprehend that they were doing, because at the time of the building it, obviously none of these things are aligned. So that comes into the question of, how did they get that knowledge? How did they work that out? Or in the case of the Sphinx, I believe, was it built during that time to represent that?
I think it was built during that time to mark the time, and we can get into that. But going to the Sphinx, because we were talking about this, there's evidence that it's been reconstructed, but the Sphinx, the body of the Sphinx, is clearly a lion, and it is facing the sunrise. Okay, and at that exact time, that star map has the Milky Way and Orion's belt aligned. At that exact time, when the Sphinx is facing the rising sun, the astrological sign behind the rising sun at that same time would have been Leo. So the lion's body, the Sphinx, would have been looking at its mirror image, the Leo, in the sky at the time that the sun rose. Interesting.
And these sort of things are the things that your typical Egyptologists disregard. They don't pay attention to the astronomical alignments, and they work on what they find around the pyramid, or what they've already got in, you can call it either a dogmatic view.
Yeah, so it seems that their view, it's very narrow in scope. It doesn't incorporate all of these other sciences. That's the problem, is that in order to really fully understand the depth of knowledge and wisdom that these people had, you need mathematicians, astronomers, geologists, to be able to understand it and to date things accordingly. So I think that is the flaw in the Orthodox Egyptologists' point of view, is that the scope with which their study observes is very narrow and doesn't incorporate these other sciences. And if they did, they would probably have a much fuller understanding. But as you kind of alluded to, they're very possessive in their understanding of this history. And I also think that they kind of want it to be very much connected to Egypt itself and the current Egyptian culture itself, and don't want to take away from that or imply that it wasn't anything to do with another ancient culture or anything like that. So there is just sort of like a possessiveness to the history, don't you think?
100%. And you can see that every time there's a rebuttal, and it always comes from Zahi Hawass, who, if any of you don't know, Zahi Hawass is pretty much the dictator and the governor of all things Egyptologist. Doesn't matter where you go. He's the Secretary General of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities. Check out the name for a little bit of glorification there. And he's also a National Geographic explorer. But he is at the center of everything. Whenever there's nothing gets certified when it comes to anything found in Egypt unless it goes through Zahi Hawass. And he's a big player in the picture that I believe that he has found a lot of great things. And we'll get into this a little bit later. Like and some of the things that he has found, you can't disregard because it does point to certain evidences of time frames. And we can get to that in debate stage or whenever you want.
Right. Well, you know, this star map that the ancients seem to be recording in a third dimensional construction of the pyramids as well as the Sphinx, which dates back to 10,500 BC. It does call into question this Orthodox Egyptology view written in all the history books of the time in which the structures were actually built. So I want to hand it over to you, speaker, and talk a bit more about the debate on when these monuments were built.
Well, like I said, most people agree on the Great Pyramids. Most people, obviously not you, but most people agree on the dating of the Great Pyramids because there has been plenty of things found around the pyramids. One of them is the dwellings of these engineers. That you can say there's been villages found of them that where they live close to the monument. So there has been relics found. There's a lot of things with Khufu, Khafre's name in relation to the pyramids. Not necessarily that it was a tomb for them. And I think these are important things that we got to kind of separate and segregate, because I do think that Egypt, of course, had a hand in building these pyramids. The Sphinx is a different story. We can go into a whole different section on that. But with the Great Pyramids, they were clearly at least helped or organized by these Egyptian engineers, you can say. But what gets me is, how did they get this knowledge? It's not that I don't think they helped. I clearly think they do. But the knowledge that has just kind of sprung up from nowhere. And you're talking about a time that was still in the Bronze Age. We haven't even got to the Iron Age yet.
Yeah, I mean, according to their timeline, Egypt had only just emerged from the Stone Age, and then they built these masterpieces of mathematics and engineering and astrological alignment. It just doesn't make sense. And then also where they date the Great Pyramids, not in the Third Dynasty, but in the Fourth
Fourth
Dynasty.
Dynasty.
Right. So there are pyramids from the Third Dynasty and the Fifth Dynasty that are practically rebel at this point. And so
the step pyramid pretty much being
right.
one of them. That was prior to the Great Pyramid. But the thing that I think you're alluding to here is it was almost like they went from nothing to the Great Pyramids back to nothing.
Right.
Because the pyramids after the Great Pyramids are incredibly not impressive at all. They're rubble. You can't even pretty much tell what they are. That is like someone building the Empire State Building, and then from that going downwards to building a townhouse.
Exactly. It doesn't make sense unless the Great Pyramids were either built by another ancient culture or inspired by another ancient culture that had the knowledge and wisdom. Then something happened, and it was like they had to start over again, right?
That's like you said, they had to get the knowledge from somewhere. These sort of feats have to be taught to either civilization or something. You don't just have these skills. And if you look back 20 years ago, everyone was saying the pyramids were built by slaves. Now they don't say that. They say it was built by these Egyptian engineers, masters of their crafts that were paid. So even they changed their point of view because they can't debate it anymore, right? Anyone that says that slaves built the pyramid is fooling themselves.
No, they were clearly really masters of what they did. We still can't figure out the precision and the tools that they used that were supposed to be according to that time in order to achieve the precision that they achieved. I mean, there are pieces of granite inside inside the pyramid in the chambers that were cut with such precision that one gentleman, I can't remember his name, I believe he was an engineer, but he determined that it would have to be done by some sort of power tool. There was no tool at the time in order to cut that kind of precision work into granite. And even harder rock too has been found too to have been cut. So they don't really know how they could have been cut other than by the use of power tools, which they were not supposed to have, obviously.
It's like you got to look at, and some of these stones and some of these granite stones came all the way from Aswan, which is about 500 miles away from the Great Pyramids, which was apparently transported by boats down the Nile. That, once again, is also debatable. But the thing with these granite stones and some of these granite rocks, and like you alluded to before, in the video that we did about the Georgia Guidestones, I watched a whole video on granite cutting for that, because I wanted to see how they did it. Now, if you took the Georgia Guidestones for an example, right, they stand about 16 feet high, and they weigh on average about 19,000 kilograms, so about 19 tons. That's the Georgia Guidestones. It took them like 6 months to put up that monument, and that was the largest job that quarry in Georgia has ever had. The way they lifted those stones, they had to use explosives, they had to use electric cutters, they had to use laser cutters for a 19-ton stone. Now we're talking about stones that are 70 ton.
Yeah,
without modern day equipment.
It boggles my mind. But we know that something could have happened. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that a cataclysm did occur sometime between 12,800 BC and 11,600 BC. There was this sharp freeze around 12,500 BC that may have been caused by a comet breaking up and impacts that hit the earth, and then sheets of ice melted into the Gulf Stream, cooled it, and so the whole earth was just plunged into a freeze. And then again, something similar appears to have happened, but that rapidly warmed up the earth at around 11,600 BC, and could have been another impact hitting the ocean, warming things up and causing a lot of torrential rain and flooding. And so that could lead to a lot of explanation if there was, for example, an ancient civilization that was nearly wiped out but a very highly advanced ancient civilization that could have had this knowledge of math, of astronomy, of the dimensions of the earth, of so much, and was nearly wiped out. But these could be remnants of that, would you think?
Yeah, so the pyramid you're referring to is the Younger Dryas period, which is an incredibly mysterious period because, like you said, those two spikes, we don't really know what happened. And that can factor in a lot of things. I mean, I'm also going to bring up Gobekli Tepi here because we see these temples not to the extent of the Great Pyramid, but built in Turkey in a place called Gobekli Tepe. Now, these stones were erected; they're monuments. It's a temple at a time when no one was supposed to be building these things, and that civilization and that find kind of relates to what a lot of people have said and have attributed to when the Great Sphinx was built. Now, it's also interesting to see that Göbekli Tepe and Egypt, or Giza, where the Sphinx is, it's only 500 kilometers away from each other across the channel.
Right. And so it's what happened in Gobekli Tepe is
Got
so
it, nailed it.
it's so strange because it was a very nomadic and primitive culture there, and it was just like immediately this really wise, very knowledgeable culture just sprung up out of nowhere and built this elaborate structure. I mean, they're still trying to excavate it, right? I mean, they
Yeah,
haven't fully excavated it, but it's incredibly elaborate. A lot of math and astronomy involved in that one as well. And it's around the same time, this time, it looks almost as though an ancient civilization that was very wise, very advanced, was nearly wiped out by some sort of cataclysm and then was displaced. And we see these little spots spring up out of nowhere with just incredible wisdom out of nothing. It goes from, a primitive sort of culture into an incredibly advanced culture overnight. And it doesn't make any sense.
no, it's strange, and these are the questions that you have to ask, and these are the questions that typical Egyptologists say, nah, it's they don't even debate it. And one of the debates for the Sphinx is if this water erosion that came at the top of the Sphinx, they said that has to be, well, some people have said that could only happen during a time of torrential rain in Egypt, which the only time when that was happening is back through the equinox that you were saying, and around about the same time as the Younger Dryas period.
Right. Around 10,500 BC was the last time there was torrential rain in Giza. During the end of the Younger Dryas period, where there was some sort of global warming that immediately happened. Maybe it was some impact from a piece of a comet, whatever it was. It caused the Earth to rapidly warm, and it caused the Earth to have a lot of flooding and rain for a very long period of time. And you want to talk about the erosion on the body of the Sphinx and how that correlates? Because I saw, who was it? Oh, I'm gonna have to look back at my notes.
John Anthony West.
Yes, John Anthony West had discovered this, and I don't know why the Egyptologist hadn't realized this, but it's very clear even to an untrained eye like myself. But looking at it, you can tell how it looks like a very long period of time it had rained, because the edges of the lion's body are rounded off and there are grooves, like water grooves dug into it, as though it had withstood a heavy, heavy rain.
Yeah, so he went to the council, and this was during the 90s of Egyptologists in Cairo, and they couldn't debate his theory on this, and that it had to be made by torrential rain, when at the time most of the people were saying it was made by the flooding of the Nile. Now, there was floodings of the Nile periodically through that time as well. But the way these things are like a curve down is it could only happen by rain. Floods rise up, not down. So it's and the only way that they got out of that discussion with him is they just pretended like it didn't happen.
Now, if there was torrential rain for a very long time in that area on the Sphinx, could it have damaged the head of the Sphinx so much so that the entire head of the Sphinx was replaced by a later culture at a later time? And could it have been originally a lion's head that was just completely replaced then later by a human's head?
Just completely recarved, I'd say.
Yeah, because the
Because
head doesn't match it at all. The erosion doesn't look the same. The size doesn't look the same.
no, not at all. And another thing they debate to try to calm that theory down is that, okay, so say if it was built during that time, what happened between the gap between then and the Great Pyramids, or the rule of Khufu? And what I can think of in that is that you're also dealing with a point of time when this Younger Dryas period was happening, and there was great floods right through Egypt, Middle East, all across the Northwest. And that would have to play a huge part in the disappearing of whatever culture was there prior, because they would have to move. You can't stand, you couldn't have a civilization there at that time during these hostile weather conditions. So maybe that played a part in displacing these people or cutting down their population. Or maybe they left and even came back, and the Sphinx was just a monument that was left over there.
Right. That's what I tend to think, is that they were displaced during that time for thousands of years, and then they came back. And these were remnants of a more ancient time. But, Plato, he talked about the story of
We're getting to
Atlantis.
conspiracy now? Boom.
Can we? Let's do it.
Yeah, let's go. Let's go into conspiracy. Now we've given you the facts and we've given you what we know. Now let's go into the deep end and let's just go to the crazy shit.
Hey, look, you know what? Okay, it's not me. It's Plato. Call him the conspiracy theorist. Right? So he talks about the story of Atlantis. And the story of Atlantis falls in that same timeline, okay, of the Younger Dryas. And he said he learned the story, which was passed down by Egyptian priests, and that in a single day and night, this highly advanced civilization of Atlantis was completely wiped out through earthquakes, fire, and flood, 11,600 BC, or 11,600 BC. So then suddenly all these ancient structures start popping up, like Gobekli Tepi. And then you can't deny that these structures have within them this incredible knowledge and history and wisdom that doesn't seem to be matched.
It seems to be out of place in history. That sort of skill is completely out of place in history. I mean, there's fantastical things built in ancient Rome. I've also been to the Colosseum. I've seen a lot of ancient structures in Italy, and they were built during the Iron Age, and they still, not much of it stands. Not much of, like, at all. The Colosseum's half gone. And yes, it's impressive, but it's nothing compared to the pyramids.
Right. And if you want to talk about the Sphinx and some of the chambers, because from what I understand, they've, through using certain instruments, discovered that there's a chamber or a series of chambers underneath the Sphinx as well, which no one, I believe, has been permitted to explore. But some believe it actually may contain and be an ancient hall of records of Atlantis, the lost history of their
Oh,
civilization, which Plato spoke about. So, what do you
there,
think about that?
there she goes, ladies and gentlemen. That's the edge. That's the edge we know and love. I think that's an interesting theory, but with nothing to back it up, I can't say one way or another.
Well, I think that there is some science to back it up, that there are structures or there are cavities, caverns, or something
Cavity's a good word.
beneath the Sphinx, and they seem very protective about not allowing people to explore that.
Egyptologists are very protective of letting no one explore anything in Egypt but them. It's always been the case. I mean, most people can't even go into the Great Pyramids.
Right. So it seems like they're very protective of the history. They want to control the narrative on it. And instead of letting science lead the way, it's more about protecting a certain narrative. Is that
And and
what you
and
think?
yeah, well, like again, going back to Zahi Hawass, every time something comes out that critiques Egypt, he is the first one on to blow the whistle or something or try to debunk it, or and he's always angry when he does it. So I watched a few things, and a perfect example of that was Elon Musk the other day. And it's really weird because every time we decide to do a podcast, something kind of fits into it with the narrative that just happens on our feed. It's really weird.
It is. We're like,
And
oh, let's talk about something random. Let's talk about the pyramids. And then all of a sudden, Elon Musk goes out tweeting that the pyramids were built by aliens.
yeah, so there's always something that just clicks for us. I don't know. It's really weird. But when Elon Musk said that, hi, Zahi Hawass rebutted him straight away, and it was a real angry video where he was like, no, we found these places. It was built by Egyptians, and it's never we found. It's always I found. I found these villages of these engineers, and I found this, and I found that. So we'll play that video on screen as we're talking, but you can see him, and he's visually angry at just something of a tweet, and that kind of has to get you a little suspicious. I mean, plenty of people have tweeted that there's heaps of theory that the pyramids had to be built by at least a civilization that was extremely intelligent. A lot of people say aliens. It's out there. It's a theory.
Yes, yes. And we'll get into that in a second. But I want to talk about how there has been this need, this push to control the narrative and to not allow science to just discover the true meaning and fully understand these ancient structures. And a
It's
lot of
it's
hidden knowledge that seems to be held within certain elite groups. And I want to give kind of an example of this, which I find truly fascinating. And I think that if we look in other areas, we could find a pattern of this. But this is one example. So in 1935, the architect for the Hoover Dam built the same sort of astrological map into the dam itself and inscribed the star map on the floor of the monument. And even in that inscription included, on the timeline of the star map, included the Egyptian pyramids. Okay, it referenced the Egyptian pyramids. Okay. And it did the exact same thing the pyramids do. That marks a specific time on the precession of the equinoxes, 10,500 BC. But the Hoover Dam one marks it for the specific time in 1935 in which the Hoover Dam was built. So if some cataclysm happens in the far off in the distant future, and people are trying to learn ancient history and they discover the Hoover Dam, they would be able to know exactly when that dam was built based off of the star map that was inscribed on the monument, and that actually the entire structure was built to be a mirror image of. Okay, just exactly in the same way, the Great Pyramids are a star map of the Orion's belt and the Leo uh, astrological sign. So In 1935, someone knew this information. Okay, but it wasn't actually even discovered by Robert Bauval until the 90s. And when they discovered it, they got a ton of heat for this because of the Egyptologists who were angry about this theory, as though they were covering up this narrative, and creating the narrative that they wanted. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's completely fascinating. But we see this pushback not just in uh, certain fields, but we see it in so many fields, from science to medical. Paleontology is a great example of this, and they've had to kind of pull it back lately. And these are fields that are driven by either a mainstream media narrative, an elite narrative, or an ego-driven narrative. And with paleontology, a lot of things that are being discovered now is there's a lot of dinosaurs that have been critiqued, catalogued, named, but now they're starting to find out that some of these dinosaurs are actually the same dinosaur. They're either just the male species or the female species, or they're juvenile or adolescent types. So when they're adolescents, they won't have a horn, and when they get older, they will have a horn, just for an example. But there's been paleontologists that have put their names on these things and are disputing these things simply because of the fact that they've got their names on it.
Right.
So
They
it's
don't want to change the history that they were part of creating, and they
of
want to
course.
remain part of history. And so they're totally averse to any new information or discovery. They want to preserve it as they determine it is.
And it's anything that goes against the grain, and it's perfect alignment what we're seeing now in the mainstream media, especially, well, let's use COVID as an example. Any dissenting views on medication or treatment is being attacked with scorn and conspiracy, and are being pushed under the rug, even though they're coming from reputable sources. And it's the same thing we see throughout all these fields.
Right, right. There's just always this need to preserve the orthodox point of view and not allow any new information, which is totally counterproductive if you want to learn and grow and attain wisdom and knowledge and
Of course.
understanding. And it goes against all science, because that's what the pursuit of science is. It's discovery and allowing new information to come in and testing it and seeing if it withstands the test. Uh,
And just because you don't have an answer for it, it doesn't mean it's not important. It means it is important, and you should try to find the answer for
right, but they don't even want to find the answer for it. They're
it.
just like, we don't know the answer to that, and moving on. So they just ignore it. And there's so many of those kinds of questions surrounding these ancient, humongous structures. But who do you think built it? Because that's a big question. Who? Is it just the ancient Egyptians in 2500 BC? Is it a much more ancient culture that was nearly wiped out prior to the Younger Dryas period, like, say, the Atlanteans? Or was it aliens?
Aliens.
What do you think?
What about giants?
Hey, you know where I stand on that.
I know, that's why I bring it up. Well,
Well,
go into that before I answer your question.
okay. Well, one theory is that, if you look back in the biblical texts, and it talks about the very earliest part of the text, it talks about the fallen angels, how they had mated with human women and created a hybrid called the Nephilim. And the Nephilim are said to be, as written in the Bible, are said to have been giants, literal giants. And so if those beings were walking the earth prior to a great flood, perhaps they could have assisted in building such giant structures. What do you think?
Hmm. I like how I poke you when it comes to biblical things, and you've always got it like on the bed. I find it fascinating listening to different points of view and things I don't believe. But that's a cool and interesting thing. And like I said, I don't disregard a lot of things from religious texts and stuff like that because I believe a lot of it lines up. And if you're looking at things from the perspective of the Great Flood, I mean, we've got this Younger Dryas period, not kind of so much of a myth now, is it? So
Exactly.
it's definitely a fascinating thought. So are those our three options?
No,
Giants,
no.
aliens, or
I'm just listing some of the most
Civilization.
popular, most
Hmm.
popular thoughts and schools of thought as to who could have been
Hmm.
behind the building, the design, the intent of these structures.
Really difficult question. I don't think you could know for certainty. I believe it was definitely an advanced civilization. It had to have been something, but it's a really hard one for me to answer because I'm spiritual, and I do believe there is sort of a mystic feel to the pyramids too. So could it be a whole different sort of mental state? Could it be telekinesis? Could it be something like that? That always runs through my head as well, because I believe the consciousness and especially these younger people, these younger, well, we call them ancient civilizations, had a real deep connection with nature and the stars and space, and they all had this shamanistic quality about them, and there's a very mystical quality about them. So my head always kind of goes that way. And normally I'm more grounded, but when it comes to those sort of things, my head definitely spins to maybe something like that.
Yeah, I'm kind of leaning towards an ancient civilization that, like the Atlanteans, and who were highly, highly advanced and got nearly wiped out by a flood. And there are remnants of that civilization that survived and carried down that wisdom to the Egyptians, and as we saw in Gobekli Tepi, perhaps even the Mayans and some other ancient civilizations that had received the knowledge and wisdom that was passed down to them from even more ancient civilizations. That's where I'm kind of leaning towards.
And there is, the name totally escapes me at the moment, but we see a lot in South America, these statues in that Amazon and around those areas, statues of these white bearded men completely out of place. And that has got to have to be a podcast for another time because I've forgotten the name about it, but they interest me too. I think they have a role to play in something.
Were they giants and did they have red beards? Because that might support my theory.
I don't know. The stone doesn't tell me the color of the beard.
Yeah, yeah. We'll have to get into that another time. So, but
Definitely.
let's talk about why they were built, because you kind of alluded to that when you were talking about the spirituality side of it, because there are several theories as to why they were built. I think kind of the orthodox theory is that, these were tombs and they were created to immortalize their pharaohs, but also to send them to the heavens, to the stars. And you can see with the shafts that lead out of the chambers, the king's chamber and the queen's chamber, they are actually aligned with certain stars that are associated with Osiris and Isis. So there's that theory that these did have a very spiritual meaning to the people of that time, and that it was actually a tool used to transfer a soul from the physical world to the spiritual world. What do you think about that?
I could get behind that.
Mm-hmm. But then there's this suggestion by Graham Hancock that, you know, and the Hoover Dam, kind of the story of the Hoover Dam that I explained kind of supports this, is that the monuments were also built to withstand the test of time and survive even a cataclysm, and tell future civilizations like ours that there was an ancient, highly advanced civilization. Because it's as though when these cataclysms happen, human civilization starts over and our memory is just wiped. But for these monuments that survive. So what do you think of that theory?
I can get behind that too.
Yeah.
I'm like all of these things are plausible to me. What's not plausible to me is that this thing was just simply built for a tomb. There's too much to it.
Way too much.
Too much. There's too much involved.
Then we have Tesla's theory, and I find this absolutely fascinating.
I don't know about this, so I'm really interested to hear about it. Send it.
Okay, so in 1905, Tesla filed a patent for the art of transmitting electrical energy through a natural medium using a system of worldwide generators to harness the Earth's energy. Okay, so using the right shape, he theorized you could harness the Earth's energy. The Earth has kinetic electric energy. Okay, and so this shape that is referred to as Tesla's electromagnetic pyramid is the shape of a pyramid or a cone shape. Okay, so in other words, there's this theory that these ancient structures, like the Great Pyramids, had the same idea as Tesla. And there was these structures weren't just tombs or monuments. They were actually used to harness, to harmonize with the Earth's frequency and harness its energy. What do you think?
I like anything Tesla gets behind.
Yeah, it's interesting. So
Well,
these
if you want to understand the universe, frequency, energy, and vibration.
exactly, because that also gets into the spiritual aspect of things. Understanding on a scientific level things that are beyond this third dimension, that are more in the frequency of things dimension. So it's a lot to go into there, and I don't think we'll go into depth there, but it's just fascinating. But you know, when you look at the subterranean chambers, chamber of the Great Pyramid, there appears to be evidence that it was carved out specifically for acoustic purposes, and these shafts as well, because the acoustics are undeniable inside of this thing. You can hear from the subterranean chamber, you can hear someone singing in the high chamber, in the king's chamber. And so it appears as though the chambers were carved out for acoustics, which kind of goes in line with this idea of they were made for a specific way to harness the harmonics, the frequencies of the Earth in order to harness its energy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, fascinating.
There's, and I don't think it's something we're ever going to figure out. What do you all think? Watching the video, what's your ideas? Please chuck them down below. We would like to hear them, because like I said, we have no answer. This is just a conversation. A lot of questions to ask,
and there's a lot of different points of view and perspectives, so we wanted to kind of give you guys all of them in a short period of time and let you form your own opinions on them. And we'd love to hear what you guys think below, so leave a comment. And thanks for listening to us here today on this episode on the Great Pyramids with Speaker and Edge on HiveMind. Please be sure to share, like, subscribe, and hit that bell. We'll see you back next time right here on HiveMind.